The autumn wind of 1776 bit sharply through the cobblestone streets of Lower Manhattan, carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke and the oppressive weight of British occupation. Crimson coats dominated the horizon, a stark reminder that New York City was no longer a haven for free men, but a fortress for King George III. From the window of his opulent Wall Street townhouse, Silas Vance watched a patrol of redcoats march past. To the world, Silas was a man of impeccable loyalty to the crown, a wealthy merchant whose shipping vessels kept the British garrison well fed and clothed. General Howe himself had toasted to Silas's loyalty. But beneath the fine velvet coat and the polished silver buckles lay the beating heart of a rebel. Silas Vance was a ghost in his own city, a man living a dangerous double life. In the eyes of the British, he was a pillar of the empire. To General George Washington, he was simply Agent Culper Jr. Silas turned away from the window as the grandfather clock chimed midnight. The grand house was silent, his servants long asleep. He retreated to his private study, locking the heavy oak door behind him. The room was choked with the smell of rich leather and pipe tobacco, but Silas wasn't there to rest. He approached a hidden floorboard beneath his mahogany desk, prying it open to reveal a small glass vial and a goosequill pen. The vial did not contain ordinary ink. It held a specialized chemical compound, a formula known only to Washington's inner circle. To the naked eye, the liquid was completely invisible once dry, leaving nothing but blank parchment. With steady hands, despite the adrenaline pulsing through his veins, Silas dipped the quill into the invisible fluid. He began to write on a fresh sheet of paper, his mind racing. Earlier that afternoon, a high-ranking British major had carelessly revealed a shipment of heavy artillery arriving at the harbor, intended to crush the Continental Army's defenses across the river. 3 frigates arriving by dawn, Silas wrote, the words vanishing into the fibers of the paper as soon as they left his pen. Regiments moving north toward the heights. Washington must withdraw. Every stroke of the pen was an act of high treason. If discovered, there would be no trial, no mercy, only the short drop and a sudden stop on a British gallows. Just as he finished the final sentence, a sudden heavy knock echoed from the front door downstairs, shattering the midnight silence. Silas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs as the shouting of British soldiers pierced the night. Would you like to proceed with Part 2, Whispers in the Tavern, to see how Silas handles the soldiers at his door? The pounding at Silas's front door had been a routine patrol checking curfews, a heart-stopping scare that he managed to defuse with a warm smile, a bottle of fine Portuguese port, and a perfectly played part of a sleepy, loyal merchant. But the close call was a grim reminder. The walls of Manhattan were closing in. To confirm the troop movements he had written about, Silas needed concrete details. He needed to go where the British let their guard down. The next evening, Silas stepped into the warm, smoky chaos of the Queen's Head Tavern. The air was thick
thick with the scent of roasted mutton, stale ale, and wet wool. Laughter and clinking pewter mugs echoed off the low timber ceilings. Red-coated officers dominated the tables, celebrating what they believed was the imminent surrender of the rebel army. Silas, dressed in his finest woolen coat, navigated the crowded room with practiced ease, nodding politely to familiar faces. He slid into a dimly lit booth in the far corner, near a table occupied by 3 high-ranking British officers. Ordering a pint of dark ale, Silas leaned back, casually unfurling a loyalist newspaper while tuning his ears to the voices behind him. "The rebels think they can hold the northern ridge," a young lieutenant sneered, slurring his words slightly from the gin. "They have no idea General Clinton is already moving the vanguard." Silas stared at his newspaper, his eyes fixed on a meaningless advertisement, but his mind was burning every word into his memory. "Aye," a gruff voice replied, Colonel Tarleton's aide. "By Thursday night we flank them from the East River. We'll trap Washington in his own trenches before he even smells the gunpowder. The war will be over by winter." It was the exact piece of the puzzle Silas needed, the flank route and the precise timeline. He took a slow sip of his ale, mapping out the courier route in his head. But as he began to slide out of his seat to make his exit, a heavy shadow fell across his table. Silas looked up to find Major Harrison, a sharp-eyed British investigator known for his ruthless hunt for rebel spies, staring down at him. "Mr. Vance," Harrison said, his voice dangerously smooth, "fancy meeting Manhattan's most prosperous merchant in a common tavern. And so quiet, too. You've barely touched your drink, yet you seem deeply invested in local politics." Harrison's eyes flicked to the blank margins of the newspaper Silas held, then drifted down to Silas's hand, which was subtly trembling. The silence between them grew suffocating, thick enough to cut with a blade.
Silas's heart hammered against his ribs under Major Harrison's cold stare, but he forced a hearty, aristocratic laugh. "Ah, Major, I was merely calculating the losses on my latest cargo ship. This rebellion ruins business for us all." The lie slid smoothly from his tongue, and Harrison, though suspicious, stepped aside with a curt nod. Silas didn't waste a second. He slipped out into the freezing rain, retrieving his hidden horse and galloping toward the darkened banks of the Hudson River. The night was a tempest. Savage wind whipped across the black water, throwing violent waves against the rocky shore. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking into the freezing mud. Waiting in the reeds was a small wooden rowboat, hidden weeks ago for an emergency just like this. He pulled the invisible ink dispatch from his breast pocket, wrapping it tightly in a waterproof oilskin. If the water swallowed him, the secrets would die with him. If the British caught him, he would hang. "Stop right there, in the name of the king!" A shout pierced the howling wind. Silas spun around. Through the sheets of torrential rain, lantern light flickered on the ridge above. A patrol of British dragoons, alerted by Harrison's growing suspicion, had tracked him. Muskets flared, and a lead ball whistled past Silas's ear, shattering a nearby tree branch. With desperate strength, Silas shoved the heavy rowboat into the churning river and threw himself over the gunwale. The freezing water numbed his hands instantly as he grabbed the oars, pulling with everything he had. Behind him, the soldiers reached the shore. "Fire!" a voice bellowed. Another volley of musket fire erupted, the bullets splashing violently into the water around his tiny vessel. The wind roared, threatening to capsize the boat, and the current dragged him dangerously downstream. Silas pulled against the tide, his muscles screaming in agony, his vision blurred by rain and sweat. He could hear the shouts of the soldiers fading into the distance, but the river itself was now his deadliest enemy. A massive wave crashed over the bow, filling the boat with icy water. Struggling to breathe, Silas looked ahead through the darkness. On the far shore, nestled in the shadows of the New Jersey Palisades, a single secret lantern flickered twice. Washington's scouts were waiting. With one final agonizing burst of strength, Silas rode into the dark, leaving the pursuing empire behind in the storm. Shivering violently and soaked to the bone, Silas dragged himself onto the muddy banks of New Jersey as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed through the thick river fog. Before he could collapse, rough but gentle hands pulled him from the freezing water. Washington's sentries had found him. Whispering the secret countersign, Silas fumbled with numb fingers inside his wet coat, retrieving the waterproof oilskin packet and pressing it into the officer's hands. Within hours, the dispatch was rushed to a nearby farmhouse serving as the Continental Army's temporary headquarters. Over the warm glow of a candle, the invisible ink slowly revealed itself, the chemical compound turning dark and legible under the heat. Silas's message was clear. The British were planning a devastating flank attack, but their vanguard was exposed. General George Washington himself studied the newly revealed intelligence, his grim expression softening into one of quiet resolve. The information was precise, invaluable, and timely. Silas's desperate midnight crossing had handed the Americans a lifeline. Armed with this critical knowledge, Washington would pivot his strategy, laying the groundwork for a daring, unexpected strike across the icy Delaware River at Trenton, a battle that would ultimately turn the tide of the American Revolution. While the generals and officers hastily drew up their counteroffensive in the main room, Silas sat quietly in a corner by the hearth, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket and nursing a hot mug of coffee. His body was battered and exhausted, but a profound sense of peace washed over him. An officer approached him, asking for his real name so that his heroism could be officially recorded and rewarded. Silas looked up, a faint, weary smile playing on his lips. "In the annals of this war, my name does not matter," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The birth of a free nation is a reward enough." As the sun finally broke through the gray autumn clouds, Silas cast off his blanket and pulled his damp, aristocratic coat back on. The warmth of the camp had to be left behind. He had to cross back into the perilous shadows of occupied Manhattan, back to the lies, the whispers, and the dangerous double life. For Silas Vance, the war was far from over, but as he looked out across the river, he knew he had helped strike a spark that would soon light the way to liberty. He slipped quietly back into the morning mist, a silent, unsung hero of the American dawn.